Hello, this is Theodore Holden again, Southeast Texas, and what I want to talk about today is the flood at the time of Noah, Genesis 7. Okay, and the story of the flood involves elements of religion, philosophy, and science, right, mixed together. Um, I do not want to be in the business of telling people what to think or what to believe. What I'm presenting here is just my own beliefs as to what the story of the flood amounts to. For whatever it's worth, there are several elements to the story. Um, the way I would describe it, I mean, the major elements, I count five, right? I get one around 3,500 to 5,000 years ago, some kind of a cosmic disaster caused the entire earth to be flooded. Nearly all of the people and animals living on the earth at that time perished in that flood. Number two, the flood was believed to have amounted to a cleansing or a punishment of the earth by God for sinful conduct on the part of humankind. Number three, God warned one man, Noah, to build a gigantic wooden ship or ark within which to save his own family and breeding pairs of all animals with which to start the living world over again after the flood. Number four, Noah obeyed this command. He and his family survived and the animals in the ark survived, but nothing else on the earth survived other than fish and possibly seabirds. Number five, there have been other cosmic disasters of a global nature, both before and after the flood. Nonetheless, this flood was the most major such event that our planet has ever experienced. The story about a global flood causes a great deal of consternation amongst academics who still believe in evolution. And you might ask yourself why that might be. The theory of evolution itself is part and parcel of a larger doctrine, which you would call a paradigm, which is called uniformitarianism. Okay, uniformitarian. That's 9 syllables in an English word, sort of rare. At any rate, the basic idea of this larger paradigm is that changes in biological and geological forms take place only very, very slowly, in fact, so slowly as to be imperceptible to anybody living and observing at the time, right? And that these kinds of changes take place over millions and tens of millions of years, and take place only according to processes which we can observe in action in the world now. Okay, so that the idea of a global flood with nothing like it having happened prior to that time, nothing like it having happened since that time, and without any proximate cause that we can detect. I mean, that blows the whole paradigm, right? In other words, that they have a hard time. They will typically claim either that the flood itself is a fairy tale of some sort or that it amounts to an aggrandized version of a story about some local flood, usually in the region of the Black Sea, right? They'll claim that there's evidence of some sort of a flood having taken place maybe 4,000, 5,000 years ago in the region of the Black Sea, right? But, they'll always claim that it was a localized flood and that the story that you read in the Bible is an aggrandized version. Okay, so for starters, um, let's look at the question of claiming that the flood itself was a fairy tale. Now, I used to write the macho fairy tale section for the old Fantech Journal in the Washington, D.C. region, like the story of Henrietta Johnson and the Three Bears, or, the wolf and Ma Barker's granddaughter, things like that, right? So I have a sort of an appreciation of fairy tales, and what I've seen doesn't really resemble a fairy tale like in any way, shape, or manner. I've got something I'd like you to watch about 8 minutes of, right, which is this expedition of Philip Williams, right? And this is like a significant scientific expedition out there in the mountains of Turkey, right? Like about 13 or 14,000 feet up. And, you know, like I said, watch this for about 8 minutes and you be the judge, and then we'll get to the question of whether or not the story that you read in Genesis 7 could possibly be a tale, you know, like an aggrandized version of some kind of a story of a localized flood. Now, as to the claims that the story in Genesis 7 could plausibly amount to an aggrandized version of a story about a more localized flood, possibly some kind of a very large flood around the Black Sea area. It turns out, and this is almost comical, it turns out that the story in Genesis 7 is even bigger than a story of a global flood. It's a story of a solar system-wide event. Okay, so it's not as if the only people who saw this flood were people living on Earth. Somebody on Mars or somebody on Venus wouldn't have seen it, right? It's like, this event basically affected the entire solar system. Now, in Genesis 7, twice within a space of one paragraph, there's a mention of the 7 days just prior to the flood. Okay, behold, for yet 7 days, and I shall cause, then after one paragraph, and so it came to pass after 7 days that the waters of the flood were upon the earth, right? And you might wonder what that's about, right? After 7 days worth of what, right? And I mean, you could ask just about any sort of a religious expert that you might have contact with, what he knows about that. You're not going to get too many people raising their hand. There's one other place in the Bible that talks about the 7 days before the flood, and this would be in Isaiah 30:26. In which Isaiah is talking about the end of the world out in far time. And he makes a very vague sort of a reference, which he doesn't bother to explain, since he assumes that everybody in his audience knows what this reference means, what it's about. Okay, he says, the light of the moon shall be as the light of the sun, and the light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 days. Okay. And this passage is mistranslated in the newer Bibles. It's not mistranslated in the King James. What it sounds like the guy is saying is that the sun will be as bright as if you were to somehow manage to cram 7 days worth of daylight into one day, right? And the new Bibles, the NIV, I believe, inserts the word full. It said the light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of 7 full days, and that locks the mistranslation in. Okay, because Isaiah's not talking about cramming 7 days worth of daylight into one day. He's talking about the 7 days before the flood that you read in Genesis 7, right? 7:4 to 7:10, and what I believe to be the case is that the King James was the version of the story that you read in the King James was translated out of some language which, like Russian, doesn't use articles, doesn't use words like the or a, right? So in other words, it should read, the light of the sun shall be sevenfold as the light of these 7 days. Okay, and the Old Testament, the Torah, turns out to be a kind of a Reader's Digest version of what Jews would call midrashim, the full body of very ancient rabbinical literature. Now you've got one very large collection of midrashic sources, like in English and German, right? This was like Louis Ginsberg's 7-volume Legends of the Jews, published in the early years of the last century. And what he says, and what the midrashic sources say, is that the Lord turned on the primordial lights of the universe to commemorate the death of Methuselah, who died a week before the flood. It died the week prior to the flood. And when you talk about turning on the primordial lights of the universe, well, what you're talking about is, if you translate that into scientific terms, you're talking about a nova or something similar to a nova-like event, right? It's like for a main sequence star like our sun, like our present sun, to go nova would fry the whole system to cinders. We wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. Okay, so what is the next item down on the list of things which conceivably could cause, 7 days of intense light and radiation and still not fry the system to cinders? That would be a dwarf star flare event. Okay, we've got in past ages two dwarf stars in our system. The two main gas giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, used to be dwarf stars. When a dwarf star is captured by a main sequence star like our sun, the dwarf star goes out. It ceases to be the focal point of any sort of a Birkeland current or cosmic electrical discharge, right? So that what the story in Genesis 7 is really saying is that you had like a dwarf star flare event, most likely Saturn, okay, and then 7 days of intense light and radiation, the Lord turning on the primordial lights of the universe, and then you have the flood, okay, so that you've got here basically a solar system wide event, and that's about as far away from a local flood as you could come up with. Remember I said that I am not in the business of telling people what to think or what to believe, and am merely presenting my own take on the story of the flood and the evidence available for understanding the story. And I'm going to want to switch the order of the next two items. Both of these items have a philosophical component, so that there are questions of interpretation. Okay, item number 3, the question of God warning Noah to get into the shipbuilding business to try to construct an absolutely gigantic wooden ship with which to save breeding pairs of the animals that you would want to try to save. And I simply don't have a problem with that. God is primarily about information, as nearly as I can tell. He provides humans with the information they need to deal with the physical world that we live in. He does not appear to take a direct hand in large-scale physical events. Okay, at least. So, there's no reason not, to my way of thinking, not to accept that story the way that it's written in the Bible. Now, there's one other kind of a thing that you should notice, and that is that in Genesis, prior to the flood and prior to the event associated with the Tower of Babel, God speaks to humans directly. Okay, I mean, you don't need intermediaries, you don't need prophets in Genesis, right? The words prophet and prophecy, which permeate the rest of the Old Testament after Genesis, appear only once in Genesis, which is a vague reference to Abraham as God's prophet after the flood and after the event involving the Tower of Babel. Okay, what I believe to be the case is that this thing that I call the antediluvian communication system is involved in this story. Now, Greg J. and I produced a sort of a long video which is available on both of our channels, on my channel, on the channel which is called Ganymede Hypothesis. There's a line going across which says Greg J. videos, right? And this thing about the antediluvian communication system and the question of telepathic communication prior to the flood and prior to the Tower of Babel is dealt with. Okay, that's a large and complicated story, but again, to my way of thinking, the story of God warning Noah that he needed to to take immediate steps, right, to begin the construction of a ship made out of wood, which was probably considerably beyond anything which had gone prior to that time. Now, there's another question, which is the question of whether or not you could actually build a ship that large out of wood and have it function properly. Now, you get a lot of experts that claim, supposed experts that claim that you can't, right? That you simply couldn't build a wooden ship that large. You know, part of the thinking involved is that Europeans never really built wooden ships any more than a couple of 100 feet long, right? So, I mean, what you're talking about with this Ark of Noah's is something that's more like 450 or 500 feet long. Now, the problem is that nobody ever explained this problem to those early Ming emperors, you know, like in the 1420s, right, who were building ships out of teak wood, which were, you know, which would ballpark for the same thing that we're talking about. They were like 400, 450 feet long, you know, 100 feet wide, something like that. And, you know, they were sailing all over the Indian Ocean, sailing all over, you know, making landfalls everywhere that you could, you know, like in South Asia and Africa, right, bringing African animals back for the zoos in China. And there's some people who believe that at least one of those expeditions ended up in the New World. You know, they got some sort of a look at California. I have no way to make any kind of a statement on that claim, right? I have no way to vet a story like that. But, like I said, the story is there. The gentleman's name, I think, was Jing He, or something like that. Again, like I said, it's interesting stuff. You know, these were wooden ships on a scale of about what you would expect for Noah and his ark. Item 2 was the question of sin being involved in the story of the flood, and you know, the claim that the flood itself amounted to a cleansing of the world or a punishment, you know, for sin on the part of humankind. And here we're really going to get into an area of philosophy rather than science. And again, I'm not in the business of telling anybody what to think, what to believe. These are just my own thoughts on the subject. Okay, I mean, I have a big problem with this one. And to my way of thinking, you know, the claim makes no sense. In other words, you know, we've seen in the first case that the flood itself was part and parcel of a solar system-wide calamity. It was a physical event, and physical events have physical causes, and the proximate cause of the flood was a dwarf star flare event, which almost certainly involved one of the two gas giant planets that we have now, which in past ages served as dwarf stars, okay, which would be Saturn. Now, you know, to get an idea of how the solar system would have been arranged before the flood, you know, the whole question of solar systems being formed up by electrical currents in space, which we call Birkeland currents, and of seeing things like that in the NASA satellite images, right, and the new telescopes that we have, what they call Herbig-Haro strings or Herbig-Haro objects, okay, which are Birkeland currents where you see stars and protostars forming up at the cross points of the two currents, which would comprise a Birkeland current. Okay. These things are described in the Ganymede hypothesis. On the internet, there's a website in which the long version of this story is presented as a free download, okay, in PDF format. It's about a 230-page book. On the internet, that's called theganymedehypothesis.com, okay? And then you've got this YouTube channel, which is called Ganymede Hypothesis, G-A-N as in Nancy, G-A-N-Y-M-E-D-E, Hypothesis, Hypothesis, right? A hypothesis is sort of a large-scale theory. And, like I say, you've got a proximate cause for a physical event. The flood itself is a physical event. Physical events generally have physical causes. So you've got that problem to deal with. Now the other problem that you have to deal with, which I believe is bigger, is that, is that there's a logical problem involved with trying to claim that the flood itself involved sin. To try to claim that that God would have wiped the entire system over sin, only to have sin back in business 40 or 50 years later as if nothing had happened, is basically accusing God of being stupid, right? And I just, my own thinking stops at that point. I don't have any picture of God being stupid. I mean, there's no evidence for that. So what exactly are you dealing with? I mean, I think you're dealing with the question of the people who wrote these stories down in later ages, right? And you've got Levites, and the basic business model of the Levites was guilt-tripping people over sin, right? So at some point you have to ask yourself, well, like, what exactly do we know about sin, right? It's a bad thing. It's not something that you would want to promote or something that you would want to get into on a regular basis. What I believe to be the case is that sin, 9 ways out of 10, amounts to a failure of moral strength. Okay, most of the time it's going to amount to going along with the crowd rather than thinking a situation through, rather than doing the right thing, rather than going through the mental exercise of determining, what God would want me to be doing, what would amount to righteousness in a given situation, and just going ahead and doing whatever feels good or whatever the crowd is doing, right? I mean, the best statement that I've ever seen or read about sin involved the American president in the 1920s, Calvin Coolidge, who was said to be like a sort of a strong silent type, man of few words. He went to church by himself one morning. His wife had a cold or something like that, couldn't make it, and he came back from church and his wife asked him, what was the sermon about this morning, dear? And he said, sin. He said, well, what did Parson Brown have to say about it? So he was against it. That may be as much as you really need. Like I said, that would be my favorite statement on the subject. You get one other kind of a thing that I might point people to, and you might try to, if you're into philosophy or anything like that, you might want to try to read through some of this stuff. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century German philosopher, the guy who claimed that God is dead, right? I mean, that's a certain amount of infamy associated with that statement. I don't believe that's what Nietzsche was about. What I believe that was basically like a 19th century academic publicity stunt. Nietzsche's real major work was a book called Genealogy of Morals, and if you really had to boil Nietzsche's writings down to one paragraph or a couple of sentences, then I think what you would say is that Nietzsche believed that Jews and Christians spent too much time worrying about sin. The final item here involves the claim that you see in the Bible that nothing survived outside of the ark. And again, I have a problem with that. This is not one of those that I could sign up for. Like I said, I believe that something like, most of the animals that we still have left owe their existence to Noah. That may run as high as 95% of the animals that we have. The animals of Asia, Europe, Africa, the Americas, right? These are the things we're familiar with, and I believe that all of these things, are descended from creatures which survived on the ark. Now the problem is the animals that you see around New Guinea and Australia, right? And Alfred Wallace, who was an associate of Charles Darwin's, described a line which is known now as the Wallace line. It's somewhere around 1860. He described this, and this is a sort of an imaginary line that runs like from southwest to northeast, right, and separates the creatures of Australia and areas around Australia from the creatures that we're familiar with. Starting from China and through Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas, right? Those are all one group, right? Um, there isn't any trail of marsupial bones leading from the Caucasus down to South India. Okay, if the creatures of Australia had been saved on the ark, the wallabies, the kangaroos, all those kinds of things, Tasmanian wolves, you had like a number of creatures which we don't have with us anymore, right? I mean, up until a couple of 100 years ago. But, like I say, you've got a choice of a couple of things you could believe with respect to those creatures. You could believe that they were somehow or other brought here to Earth after the flood, right? Or you could believe that they survived, and this would be my own personal choice. Again, I'm not in the business of telling people what to think or what to believe, but you could believe that the creatures of Australia survived in and around Australia somehow or other. The literatures of other nations describe very small groups of humans and other creatures surviving on high places or anything that could float for the better part of a year. It's not like Noah owned the only seaworthy vessel in the world, right? I mean, there were other things that could float that were out there. But again, I believe that most of the creatures that we have left are creatures that owe their existence to Noah and to the ark. Um, that's basically what I have for you today. Until next time, take care.